All right, guys. It was big news from the big fella this past Tuesday when former UFC heavyweight champion Francis Ngannou ended his free agency and signed with the Professional Fighters League. Aside from the lucrative terms to compete, we're hearing high seven figures. He also got the following: 2 to 3 fights, and then he's free again. A split from the event's net profits, a signing bonus and/or salary to serve as a brand ambassador for the PFL, the right to have his own sponsors in the cage. You know how it is. Non-exclusive with regards to boxing. No champions clause or extension, so he's not tied down. He wanted his freedom. And a minimum salary for his opponent. Get this, we've heard 1 to 2 million, but more from the 2 million side. So that's pretty big. All right, there's a lot to unpack here. Give me your reaction to this landmark deal. What stood out to you the most? And we're going to go to Mike Bond for the first take.
Yeah, good for Francis, right? That's the first reaction. He made it pretty clear from well before he finished his UFC contract that there were certain things that he was looking for, whether it was to stay in the UFC or what he would explore in free agency. And it seems like he ticked a lot of the boxes for what he wanted. I understand there's a lot of dynamics with this in terms of like the fans and how they feel about fights that they're missing or fights we may be in store for within this PFL deal. But when you run down the terms there, George, how can you be critical really of like what this man got? This is a exceptional deal that I'm sure any fighter in the sport would love to have for themselves. It's just kind of some of the other optics and stuff I understand that we'll get into where things creep in. But you run down this, I mean, what's there really to criticize here on the behalf of Francis Ngannou, who is a man of his principle through this whole thing? He did it the right way. He followed his process and what he thought was right for himself and using the leverage he did have. I mean, this is great news for him. I mean, if we go to the question that's at the ticker at the bottom there, is this a game changer for MMA? That's, I think, where there's a lot more unknowns about, right? Like Francis Ngannou had the opportunity and the position to get a deal like this for himself. I don't think you're going to see a lot of other people be able to be in the same situation and be able to leverage it the way he has. So I don't necessarily know if it's going to be a game changer for the sport as a whole, for all these free agent things like that. But for Francis Ngannou, he maximized his position, and all you can do is just kind of give him a round of applause for that.
Good stuff. All right, Ghost, channel yourself to last Tuesday when you heard the announcement and everything that came with it.
Man, I was pretty shocked. I mean, it seemed like he got almost everything that he asked for. And really what you got to do is, I guess, you got to look at it from his eyes, right? What makes him happy? He's already been a UFC champion. He's a guy that a lot of people consider the best heavyweight. He's got a win over Stipe Miocic, who's probably another guy that gets put in that talk. So he got a lot from PFL that makes him happy. But what stood out for me the most in this negotiation that I thought was kind of brilliant was he got his money before he had that boxing match. Because no matter who you are, right? If we're throwing around this is the baddest man on the planet, he goes to boxing and he gets tooled up. I'm sorry, if he were to come back to the UFC after that, I would imagine that whatever his deal is, it's probably going to be a little bit smaller because people are going to have that image of who we are calling the baddest man on the planet getting, defeated by a boxing guy and probably not looking too well in the process. He negotiated his purse before all that. So it almost doesn't matter what happens in boxing. Regardless, he comes back to the PFL and he makes big money. He makes money for other fighters. He's done a lot. And like you guys alluded to here early on, I do think this will change MMA a little bit. And if it doesn't, maybe it's a little bit of a spark that will start to do that, because you see other moments in MMA history where things like this happen, where certain fighters start to get pay-per-view points and what happens, right? The next guy's asking for the same thing. So we may not see it right away, but I think little by little, things will start to happen. And I think it's these free agent heavyweights, right? Or guys that have 1 fight left on their contract, 2 fights left. They're salivating because if you look at his timeline, 2 fights, you get that done, become a free agent, you might have a really big payday waiting for you.
All right. How about we go down to South America and get some takes from Danny Segura?
Yeah, clear win for Francis Ngannou. Same reasons that Mike Bond mentioned. Like, you just look at the contract and it seems he got everything that he wanted and more. There were some things that maybe he wasn't thinking of, like PFL Africa and stuff, and he still got stuff that he's very passionate about. I guess what I'm wondering, and I don't want to like rehash the points about this being a huge W for Francis Ngannou. But I'm just kind of wondering if this is going to be a huge win or even a win at all for PFL. And obviously there's a lot of exposure. We're talking about it right now, just having Francis Ngannou attached to the brand. And of course, when he eventually fights, it's good. But is it worth everything that they gave in that contract? Because remember, it's a power relationship between the two parties. And obviously Francis Ngannou is a very big figure and very well known, very respected. And I'm sure he does all right in pay-per-view with the UFC, but I'm wondering if under the PFL structure, if that's going to carry over. So I'm just curious to see how this all plays out. Again, clear win for Francis Ngannou, but for PFL, I think it's still a wait and see game. We'll see how this whole thing shakes out and how big these fights are come 2024.
You're right, because we got to wait till 2024 for the MMA side, and 2023 is supposed to box. And as we've all seen, those boxing matches have yet to actually materialize. There's a lot of rumors out there. There's so-called, negotiations or chatter, but nothing seems to be firm. And already the chat's lighting up. If you come strong with a good comment, I will include you in these. If you got something dumb to say, I might either jack you up or just ignore it. So it's up to you. But here, let me start off right here with this one. He says, Big Ben 316, Francis went to a place where there are no fights. Doesn't make sense at all. Look, possibly, I get it, yes and no. There's not really any big names there. Technically, Fabricio Verdum is there, right? But he's 45, he's past his prime. But maybe that's a way to, I think we've all realized that there's good fighters everywhere. And there's some UFC fighters that have gone there and haven't done well. So let's not shortchange them altogether. But he does have a strong point. We're talking about the biggest, baddest man on the planet who was supposed to do a trilogy with Miocic, maybe fight Jones, just beat Cyril Gane, the interim champ. That is a step down. I get that. So I'll give him that. But here's a dumb one. Simo 313. Francis ran from John Jones. Money is nothing when you have no legacy. Man, there was this overlap in time where John Jones could have fought Francis Ngannou. And remember, it took him 3 years from the time he vacated light heavyweight till the time he actually fought. That was a long time to get jacked and ready for heavyweight. I don't see it that way. I see it as John Jones also had an opportunity to fight Francis Ngannou. So I think that comment is unfair.
It's beyond silly too, right? Because money is nothing when you have no legacy. How many fighters leave the sport with nothing? Right? I'd rather have one or the other. Money is actually the one thing that you should lead the sport trying to have, because people like this and other critics are not going to care about your legacy, because the next heavyweight's going to come along and he's going to defend the title a few times and they're not going to care about you anymore. So getting your money and securing your bag and all that stuff should be number one priority over all these things. But the UFC life and certain things of the sport have conditioned fans into thinking this way, that Francis Ngannou should fight John Jones for $10 or something just to get his his legacy secured and stuff. And I understand he had a huge money offer from the UFC there, but what people don't seem to connect as well with the offer that the UFC did give Francis Ngannou. Yeah, it sounded like that big number, the biggest heavyweight payday ever, Brock Lesnar, all that stuff. People aren't understanding that he had lost that fight to John Jones. His contract goes all the way down to an entirely different structure at that point. And I'm guessing Francis Ngannou, the deal that he probably struck himself for PFL, if he does lose that first fight somehow, he's still going to be paid handsomely for the second fight or the third fight or whatever's on there. So I don't necessarily think that's the right way to look at this.
And if it makes money, it makes sense. Like this is prize fighting. I think if I were to, ask, who was it? Big Ben, or what was this guy's name?
Simo 313.
Or really anybody watching this or on the chat, would you rather have people think that you're cool or millions of dollars? Like, and so like the whole legacy thing is, to me, it's kind of silly. And also I think what people are missing is that Francis Ngannou is creating legacy, maybe not inside of the cage. Obviously, a fight with John Jones would be huge, and if he beat him, it'd be, it would do wonders to his legacy. But he's also doing legacy stuff outside of the cage with this PFL deal. I don't want to compare him exactly like Muhammad Ali, because that was obviously more political, but you can make a legacy outside of fighting, while you're a fighter. Right now, becoming a free agent, while champion, like this is unprecedented stuff. Getting a huge deal with PFL, this adds to his legacy. Whether it's outside the cage, it still adds to it. So I think people miss that point. But yeah, shouts out to Francis Ngannou. I mean, he gambled on himself, and it clearly paid off.
Goes, you wanted to chime in?
Well, yeah, I was just gonna say, like Mike said, if he loses that first fight in the UFC, not only does his contract get restructured, but he's in a situation where he doesn't have his freedom. And let's be honest here, guys. Like, he is not one of the favorites over at the UFC. They probably don't like him for everything that he's put him through. So what happens then? You get shelved. You get fights you don't want. You have to go places you don't want. I think there's that just doesn't make much sense. And you look at Gorgeous George and myself, we're both wearing Manchester United stuff right now. Danny Segura, what are these sponsorship contracts that happen for some of these elite fighters that go international the way a Francis Ngannou does? We don't even know what he's going to pull on the sponsorship side, and he negotiated that in his contract. That is a lot of money, man. They will give you tons of money. So there's a lot of different ways that Francis Ngannou can make money out of his contract that kind of oversteps what we all believe he'd be taking in pay-per-view wise.
Yeah, and as far as legacy is concerned, let me tell you this, guys. He's already beaten 5 guys that have worn the UFC strap at one point. One was an interim, the other 4 were undisputed. And if you throw in Alistair Overeem, who's a former K1 Supermax champ, former Strikeforce champ, and Dream champ, I mean, he's beaten a lot of people. There's a legacy there if he were to just bow out and retire. It's unfortunate he won't get to decide the trilogy with Stipe Miocic, who's regarded as the greatest heavyweight ever. Some say it's Fedor, some say it's Miocic. I don't know. And trust me, I really wanted to see the Jones fight, but I think it's a little unfair, and I think people are just jumping the gun here a little on Francis and almost coddling up to Dana White and whatever it is that he says and sells, and it's just not right. Now, there's a few things coming in right here. Some people are asking, is this live? Yes, noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. If you're watching right now, it's live. I'll try and take questions, but we move from topic to topic. So if you don't get a chance to get in during the topic, then you're going to miss out. I still got a few more things to ask the guys. If you want to ask about this, I will include you. Guys, let me ask you this. The baddest man on the planet, we knew it as Francis Ngannou when he was the champ. But since then, he has decided not to re-sign with the UFC. Let's be clear. That's how Francis said it. It went down. And John Jones has won the vacant, undisputed title. Who is the baddest man on the planet? If it's still Francis, how long can he hang on to this unofficial title? Mike Vaughn, we'll go back to you again.
I don't know. I guess it depends on the outcome of the fights, right? Like if John Jones goes in there and absolutely smokes Stipe Miocic like he did to Ciryl Gane, the argument becomes a little different. But then what if he retires after? And what if by the time Francis Ngannou fights next, John Jones is 4 months into retirement and, doing his own thing outside of the sport, right? Like we don't know what's going to happen at that point. Then I guess it's up for grabs. So it's going to obviously be harder to maintain for Francis over there. It's going to depend on who he fights, the level of competition. I mean, from my perspective, as far as like him going into this PFL debut, obviously I think he can fight almost anyone and we're all going to watch it. The intrigue factor will hook us at that point. But as you go 2 fights in, 3 fights in, how are you going to be able to pull the competition? And God forbid, right, he loses that first fight, then it's going to be really interesting. What are you going to do in terms of selecting the opponent where you can now claim the guy who beat him is the baddest man on the planet? Or is it just going to be someone no one cares about? And they're like, wow, we were right about Francis Ngannou all along. He's 37 years old, hasn't fought in 2 years and coming off a serious knee injury. All the critics are going to be there. So in that regard, this is obviously a risk for PFL and Francis. But I think that first fight, he's going to be able to kind of hold on to that as much as he wants, kind of regardless of what happens to Jones and Miocic. They'll promote the fight as such. They'll promote him as such. But depending on the outcome of, the UFC side and this side, that's where the conversation is going to become murky, I guess.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think Mike nailed it. So if you guys want to chime in, that's fine. But I want to give one again to the chat. DC7, I'm going to give this to you, Danny. He says, can you guys talk about the big obstacle being that Francis is already 36 years old? How many years can PFL get out of Francis with him already not fighting over a year and waiting another year? I think that's a great question. Let's include that here, Danny.
Yeah, that's certainly interesting. And I think to the point that you were asking earlier about the baddest man on the planet, there is something to be said about, being active and fighting frequent and being in the minds of the fan base. And for Ngannou, he hasn't fought in a year, and I do think this is fair criticism, and we probably won't see him until 2024. So in my mind, usually if you don't lose the belt, you leave the promotion as champion, I mean, I still see you as number one. But John Jones is going to be racking up wins, I assume, since he wants to be active. So that can certainly shift perspective. But yeah, this is all very interesting. Also, this deal is between 2 or 3 fights. I just wonder how much can PFL get out of Francis Ngannou in 2 or 3 fights? Enough to merit all those millions of dollars and that really lucrative contract that they dished out for him. So it's all very interesting. I also want to point out that somebody in the chat, I believe, mentioned it as well. Like DC was fighting for the belt until, you know, his early 40s. So like Francis Ngannou being 36 and just being a freak athlete as well. A lot of people just see him as old, but in heavyweight, that's not that old. I can still see him being very prime at 38, 39. I mean, if he obviously stays in shape and avoids any major injuries.
All right, I thought I could put this to bed, but there's a lot of chat still talking about baddest man on the planet. Goes, what do you think, man? They say the UFC champ is the baddest man on the planet. What do you co-sign on that, or is there a process of handing that unofficial title over? I mean, Jones is 1-0 as a heavyweight. We're not arguing his light heavyweight career. So, what do you think here?
I think it's a big 1-0, right? Because of what he did to Ciryl Gane. He went in there and made it look so easy. If he were to do that in the next fight against Stipe Miocic, a guy that gets talked about being one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, then I think that conversation keeps up, and I think he's nipping at the heels of Francis Ngannou. But chances are, I mean, a seasoned veteran like Stipe Miocic, I don't think he's going to have that type of performance. And so the longer it takes for John Jones to be in there and beat a Stipe Miocic will probably start to hurt a little bit of that talk. You know, if that ends up being a 5-round decision or something like that, I don't know that we're all jumping down Francis Ngannou's throat, right? It just kind of depends on how he keeps winning. Francis Ngannou being gone for a while, that does hurt because, you know, if you're going to talk about, there's new fans all the time. And if you have to go back years to even reference a guy's fight, that's a hard argument, right? But John Jones is already talking about retirement. So we don't even really know how long he's going to go. Let's say he does come in and beat Stipe Miocic. If he goes away, which is I think what Mike was saying, then yeah, that talk kind of goes away with him at the same time, right? If he sticks around and maybe defeats a Sergey Pavlovich, then yeah, it just keeps going. And I think it will probably get under Francis Ngannou's skin. What Francis has to do is keep winning and keep winning. If you're in the PFL, your wins have to be devastating. Everything, kind of like what he did to Overeem. Those types of highlights, I think that's how you keep that title.
All right. Really quick, Dana White had a reaction to this. He says, I know how this story ends. We have a great story there, article on the MMA Junkie website if you want to dig into it. I'm just going to give you a quick quote here, and then we got to start to move on. But he says, based on what I know about the deal, which is not much, it makes no sense to me. You're going to pay a guy not to fight for a year, and it's already been 18 months. He's fought 3 times in the last 3 years. It's just not what we do here. It's not what we do. The day we released him, we knew exactly what was going to happen. He says, I don't think he's afraid of anybody. It's just the fact that he doesn't want to take any risk. PFL is going to pay this guy to train for a boxing match that may not even happen, and they may not even be involved in. How does this make any sense? It doesn't make any sense to me. Francis, since then, has already fired back. Basically, look, I'll just sum it up. He's like, hey, why can't you just be happy for me? And he points out, you know, different things along the way. He says, I wasn't released. I decided not to resign. You can check it all on Francis Ngannou's Twitter. Again, I'm trying to rush through this because we've covered a lot. We need to move on. But I do want to go to the guys here. Also, he, kind of like what we did here, he went back into the history banks and he pulled an old tweet from Dana White, where Dana White was basically alluding to John Jones didn't want any of that smoke from Francis Ngannou, who was his champion at the time. I thought it was brilliant on Francis. Regard the internet comes through again. Mike, what did you think of that little tussle between those two on Twitter? Or sorry, I guess at the press conference and on Twitter.
Yeah. Once again, Francis, you know, I think being as classy as he can in a difficult situation where it might be hard to be classy. I mean, he'll take his little jabs here and there, but as far as like Dana's comments, I mean, he's doing what he needs to do in his position, right? Like he's not in the business of now trying to promote a former UFC champion who's fighting for the competition, if you want to frame them that way. So I wasn't expecting him to go up there and sing, you know, Francis Ngannou's praises and say how this is a landmark deal for MMA. idea is to downplay it because he doesn't want other people being like, hey, that's a great deal. Now it's no, my boss is there saying this doesn't make sense and this isn't a great deal. So, I mean, Dana's just being Dana White at this point. Nothing there surprises me. I didn't expect him to show a bunch of class in this scenario and stuff like that, which is fine. I'm not necessarily criticizing him for it, but yeah, I mean, this doesn't change too much for me. The toothpaste is out of the tube in regards to the situation, and these guys are just gonna, do what they do.
Mm-hmm. Danny?
Yeah, this is it was interesting to listen to Dana White say those comments, and you have to like parse through everything, because I do believe some stuff does have, some legs to stand on, and I think it's fair criticism, but a lot of it is promoter talk, as Mike mentioned. What is he supposed to do? Yeah, go to PFL, great offer, they're giving great contracts over there. No, he's going to say quite the opposite. But I did find his criticism around Francis Ngannou's timeline for the PFL to be very fair. Like, look, what, you're just going to sign a guy and wait almost an entire year for him to return after he hasn't fought in a year? Like that is not ideal, right? Like, you want to strike while the iron's hot. You want to strike while, this guy was just champion in the UFC just a few months ago, right? But all in all, it is promoter talk, right? Like, Francis Ngannou got a great deal. This is a huge win for him. And something that he says, like Dana White said about Francis Ngannou not wanting to take risk. Dude, not signing a contract and taking the UFC head on and becoming a free agent, waiting an entire year and seeing what the landscape of mixed martial arts is as a champion of the UFC, that is a huge risk. So, totally not, totally baseless claims there from Dana White. Huge risk taking from Francis Ngannou with all this.
Mm-hmm. He just didn't take the risk you wanted him to take.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, no, I think depending on your status in the world, like I'll give you an example. Floyd Mayweather received a lot of criticism throughout his career, but every time they would throw the bait out there, he would take it, he would latch on, and he would not stop talking. And in a way, that kind of shows that you're a little defensive and maybe like defensive, and you don't believe some of these things you're saying. Francis Ngannou has been very short and very sweet, and that's what you look at when somebody is in that position of knowing that they are right and they believe absolutely what they're saying. That's what you got to do. Keep it short and sweet, hit your points, get in and get out. You don't have to sit there and brawl all day online with people. That's just not the way to go, especially if you're the baddest man on the planet. So I kind of applaud him so far. Dana White, he's got to do that stuff, right? Like that's what he does. It's coming. But I thought Francis Ngannou did a good job of keeping it short and sweet.
Our producer, Chan Hathaway, does have a clip of that tweet. It's 35 seconds long. Let's take a listen right now at Dana White talking about John Jones about 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken.
Man, the idea of a John Jones fight seems awfully exciting right now. And John came out, tweeted, said, "Show me the money." What appeals to you most? Because it seems like that would be an amazing super fight.
If I'm John Jones and I'm home watching this fight, I start moving to 85.
You think that's a fight that you'd like to put together next? I mean, sure. I know we don't matchmake, but that sure does seem exciting.
Listen, I could sit here all day and tell you, what show me the money mean. I tell you guys this all the time. If you can say you want to fight somebody, but do you really want to?
Yeah.
Okay, so now we get it. Neither guy wants to fight each other.
Yeah, exactly. So, like I say, two sides to the coin. It's just that this is the latest, but it all is on the internet forever. Again, I'm not attacking Jones. I also think he's the greatest of all time. What he did at light heavyweight's incredible. His debut at heavyweight is amazing. But there was a period in time where he just did not want to fight. And you know what? This is fucking topic number. The next one coming up. Let's just move on.